He assumed she was just another black woman he could intimidate, until she stepped into court and dismantled his career. The road was nearly deserted that night, a few cars drifting by, their headlights bouncing off slick pavement. Streetlights flickered, casting long, shifting shadows over the highway just outside Birmingham, Alabama. It was late, just past 11. That quiet hour when most people just wanted to get home. Lieutenant Commander Amina Dawson had been driving for nearly 2 hours, her fingers tapping lightly on the wheel, humming along to the soft rhythm of an old jazz tune flowing through the speakers. She wasn't in uniform, just a plain black sweater and jeans, her hair pulled back. Nothing about her stood out, or so she thought. Then, the flash of lights in her rearview mirror, red and blue, closing in fast, her stomach clenched. Not from fear, she knew how these encounters played out. But from exhaustion, she signaled, changed lanes, and eased onto the shoulder. Placing the car in park, she exhaled slowly, keeping both hands visible. Her years in the military had taught her exactly what to do. A white patrol car pulled up behind her, its driver taking his time. When he finally stepped out, he moved like a man used to being obeyed, heavy boots scraping against the asphalt, one hand resting on his belt, the other gripping a flashlight that flicked on as he approached. She watched him through the side mirror, his badge catching the glow. Keller. License and registration. No greeting, no explanation. His tone was flat, practiced, impatient. Amina met his eyes in the mirror, then slowly reached for the glove compartment, retrieving her documents. Was I speeding, officer? Her voice was even. Keller didn't answer immediately. He took the papers, holding them just out of reach, his gaze sweeping over her car. Taillights out, he said. She frowned. That can't be right. Keller finally looked at her. Are you arguing with me? A pause. The air shifted. That unspoken moment where power met resistance, where one side expected the other to fold. She'd seen it before. In briefings, on bases overseas, in training exercises meant to prepare sailors for life beyond the Navy. She knew when to back down, but she also knew her rights. I'm just saying, she replied, her tone calm, measured. My taillights were checked recently. If there's an issue, I'll get it fixed. Step out of the car, Keller cut her off, like he hadn't heard a word. Amina exhaled, her eyes flicking to the road ahead. No witnesses, fingers tapping the wheel once, she reached for the door handle. Mind telling me why? Keller tilted his head, smirking. Because I said so. She let that hang in the air, then unbuckled her seatbelt and stepped out. The night air was crisper than she expected. She kept her posture relaxed but deliberate. Not looking for trouble, but refusing to be intimidated. Keller scanned her, calculating how much he could get away with. Turn around, hands on the car. This time she hesitated. For what reason? Keller stepped closer, his smirk fading. Are you resisting? Amina held her ground. No, I'm asking a question. Something flickered across his face. Annoyance, maybe amusement. Then, without warning, he reached for his radio. Got a non-compliant driver here, he muttered into the speaker. Then louder. Turn around. Her pulse picked up, but she kept her expression neutral. Officer, I need you to understand something, she said, her voice low but firm. I know exactly what I'm allowed to do, and I know exactly what you can't do. Keller didn't like that. His jaw tensed. You're under arrest. He reached for her wrist. Amina moved before he could grab her, stepping back just enough. Under arrest for what? Keller pulled out his cuffs. For obstructing an officer. She exhaled sharply through her nose. So that was his play. Her military training kicked in. Heartbeat steady, breathing even. She had two options. Comply and fight later, or resist and risk escalation. She wasn't about to become a statistic. Deliberately, she turned, placing her hands on the car's roof. The metal was cool beneath her palms. Keller wasted no time, yanking her arms back, tightening the cuffs far too much, shoving her toward the patrol car. "You don't know what you're doing," she murmured. Keller chuckled, forcing her into the back seat. "Lady, I know exactly what I'm doing." But he didn't. Not even close. The hard plastic seat dug into her back. Amina sat still, wrists burning against the metal, breathing measured. The door slammed shut, sealing her in. Outside, Keller strutted back to his cruiser, muttering into his radio. She glanced at the partition, her own faint reflection staring back. Calm, collected. But underneath it, something simmered. She had endured combat drills, high-stakes operations, interrogations in foreign territories. But this was different. This was a man who wore his badge like a crown, drunk on authority, convinced he was untouchable. Minutes dragged by, 5, then 10. Amina shifted her wrists, testing the cuffs. Too tight. He had done it on purpose. The driver's side door creaked open, and Keller slid in, whistling. "Well, well," he muttered, fastening his seatbelt. "Let's take a little ride." She stayed silent. He threw the car into gear, jerking it back onto the road. The patrol car surged forward, lights still flashing. In the side mirrors, red and blue streaked across the pavement, illuminating the night. "You know," Keller mused, "most folks just do as they're told." Amina exhaled sharply. "And most officers don't arrest people for questioning a traffic stop." Keller laughed, shaking his head. "Lady, you must really think you're somebody." She met his eyes through the glass. "I don't think I know." For a second, he hesitated. His fingers flexed against the wheel, a flicker of irritation breaking through his smug expression before he masked it. "You military?" His tone shifted. She didn't respond. "Yeah," he said, as if confirming a guess. "You've got that above-the-law attitude." He smirked. "Bet you thought I'd back off if you played that card." Still, she gave him nothing. Keller clicked his tongue. "Shame," he murmured. "If you'd just kept quiet, we wouldn't be here." Her jaw tensed. The audacity, as if this was her fault. Up ahead, the station loomed, a squat brick building just off the main road. The parking lot sat mostly empty. Late-night processing was slow. Keller pulled into a reserved spot, cut the engine, and turned to her through the partition. "Gotta say, I do love when they make it easy." Before she could respond, he was out, slamming his door. Seconds later, hers swung open. "Let's go," he ordered, as she stepped out, the cuffs dug deeper into her wrists. He hadn't loosened them at all. Head held high, she followed him inside, past a bored desk sergeant, through processing. The air reeked of stale coffee and sweat. A metal bench lined one wall, a steel door led to the holding cells beyond. Keller uncuffed her just long enough for booking. Fingerprints, mugshot, the whole routine. The officers at the desk barely glanced up. Just another night. She had seen this kind of indifference before, the kind that let men like Keller operate unchecked. When it was done, he grabbed her wrist again, leading her toward the cells. "You think you're smart, huh?" he muttered. She glanced sideways. "I don't have to think." His grip tightened. She knew that got to him. Keller sneered. "Enjoy your stay." He shoved her forward. She caught herself, straightened, and turned just as the bars slid shut between them. Keller smirked, tapping the metal with his fingers before walking off. The lock clicked into place. Amina inhaled slowly and sat on the bench, its cold surface pressing through her jeans, grounding her. One night, that's all it would take, because Keller had no idea who he had just messed with. The bench was cold, hard, unyielding. She rolled her shoulders, easing the stiffness creeping in. The cell was bare. 4 walls, a flickering light, the faint stench of sweat and disinfectant. She had endured worse. places where the danger was real, not just discomfort, but that didn't mean she wasn't angry. Through the bars, she heard murmured voices at the front desk, the shuffle of paperwork, the clink of a coffee cup. She exhaled. Slow, steady, control the breath, control the mind, lessons drilled into her long before she set foot in the fleet. Then, footsteps, heavy, measured, Keller. She knew it was him before he even came into view. His steps carried that same smug rhythm, like a man who believed himself untouchable. He appeared in front of the cell within moments, arms folded across his chest, that ever-present smirk plastered on his face. Comfy? She didn't answer. He tilted his head, stepping closer to the bars. You know, if you'd just gone along with it, you wouldn't be in this mess. A slow smile curved at the corners of her lips. I'm exactly where I need to be. Keller's smirk faltered, just for a second, a flicker in his eyes. Annoyance? Doubt? He covered it quickly, scoffing as he glanced at the empty holding area. No one's coming for you tonight, he said with a shrug. Guess that gives you time to reconsider that attitude. Amina remained unmoved, unwavering. Keller leaned in, voice lowering. See, here's the thing, he continued. People like you think rules don't apply. You think a little confidence can get you out of trouble? She let him talk, let him run his mouth. None of it mattered. He had no idea what was about to unfold. Right on cue, another officer approached. A younger man, probably late 20s, in standard uniform. He stopped a few feet away, clipboard in hand. Sergeant? His voice held a trace of uncertainty. We got a call. Keller barely spared him a glance. The officer hesitated, shifting his weight. And I think you should hear this. Keller frowned, casting one last look at Amina before stepping aside. She leaned back, listening. Their voices were hushed. But she caught enough. Mentions of a lawyer, an inquiry from higher-ups, questions about her detention. Keller's tone dropped, sharp and irritated. The younger officer stammered something in response. Whatever it was, it didn't please him. Then, heavy footsteps. Keller stormed back, jaw clenched, fists tight at his sides. The smirk was gone. What the hell did you do? Amina leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. I didn't do anything. She tilted her head slightly. But people talk, and some of us have friends in very high places. Keller's face darkened. Now she saw it, that moment of realization, the power shift. He wasn't in control anymore. He spun on his heel, muttering under his breath, and disappeared down the hall. Amina exhaled. It wouldn't be long now, and when the truth surfaced, he'd regret every choice that led him here. Morning, sunlight spilled through the narrow courthouse windows, streaking across polished floors. The air was crisp, the kind of chill that seeped into your bones if you sat too long. Amina stood by the defendant's table, posture at ease, eyes sharp. No handcuffs, no orange jumpsuit, no cell, just a tailored navy blazer, a simple blouse, and an undeniable presence. She wasn't alone. Beside her, Carla Whitman flipped through a stack of documents, barely glancing up as the courtroom filled. The attorney was precise, methodical. No wasted motions, no idle chatter. Amina appreciated that. The heavy wooden doors swung open. Keller entered. He still carried himself like he owned the room, squared shoulders, lifted chin. But there was a shift now, a stiffness in his movements, a trace of something new in his eyes. He wasn't so sure of himself anymore. Amina met his gaze. He looked away. Good. The judge entered. The room settled. Alan Wallace, an older man with tired eyes, adjusted his glasses as he sat down. Let's get started, he sighed, scanning the case files. The prosecutor, a middle-aged man with neatly combed hair, cleared his throat. Your Honor, We believe the defendant, Lieutenant Commander Amina Dawson, was unlawfully detained without just cause. Furthermore, he lifted a file. There is evidence of a pattern of misconduct involving the arresting officer, Sergeant Daniel Keller. A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Keller shifted in his seat, jaw tightening. The judge peered over his glasses. Sergeant Keller, care to explain? Keller leaned forward, clearing his throat. Your Honor, the defendant was uncooperative during a routine traffic stop. The prosecutor cut him off. Uncooperative? He turned, lifting a document. Lieutenant Commander Dawson's record shows a decorated military career, Naval Academy graduate, multiple commendations, no criminal history, no outstanding citations. He paused, then looked Keller dead in the eye. And you're telling me that, despite all that, you saw fit to arrest her over a broken taillight? Keller opened his mouth, then shut it. The silence stretched. The prosecutor flipped through his documents. Additionally, an internal review of your arrest record reveals a disproportionate number of traffic stops involving black drivers in this district. The murmurs intensified. Keller's expression darkened. Judge Wallace set his file aside with a sigh. Sergeant, I don't like where this is going. Keller leaned back, arms crossed. She resisted. The prosecutor raised an eyebrow. The body cam footage says otherwise. A fresh ripple of noise passed through the courtroom. Keller shifted, suddenly more defensive. I followed standard procedure. Judge Wallace wasn't convinced. He glanced at the bailiff. Let's play the footage. A screen lowered at the front. The video began. Amina didn't turn. She had lived it. The barking orders, her calm response, the needless escalation, the smug way he tightened the cuffs. When the footage ended, silence gripped the room. Judge Wallace leaned forward, fingers steepled. Sergeant Keller, you violated protocol. You made an unlawful arrest and omitted key details in your initial report. Keller opened his mouth, but the judge continued. The charges against Lieutenant Commander Dawson are hereby dismissed. His gavel struck, sharp and final, and I strongly recommend an internal review of Sergeant Keller's conduct. The tension in the room snapped like an overstretched rubber band. Keller looked gut-punched, his face burned, fists clenched at his sides. Amina exhaled. Steady, controlled. She never had any doubts. As she gathered her belongings, she cast one last glance at Keller. Their eyes met. No words were needed. This time, she wasn't the one fighting to clear her name. Keller was. He stormed out, heavy footsteps echoing down the polished halls, his jaw locked, his expression tight. He felt the stares, officers, court staff, even reporters drawn by the case's buzz. He wasn't used to this. Control had always been his. He commanded respect, or fear. Now the power he had wielded so effortlessly was slipping from his grasp. And then came the worst part. Sergeant Keller. A sharp voice cut through the noise. He turned. Chief Eldon Baker stood, arms crossed, expression unreadable. A force in the department, over 30 years on the job. His word carried weight. Keller straightened. Sir. Baker studied him for a moment, then gave a curt nod. Follow me. He led Keller into a private office. The door shut. The chief's voice dropped. What the hell were you thinking? Keller exhaled sharply. I was doing my job. Your job? Baker scoffed, tossing a file onto the desk. It landed with a heavy thud. That's not what it looks like. The body cam footage, the arrest record, the fact that Keller hadn't even known who he was arresting, Keller's nostrils flared. What does that matter? Baker leaned in. Everything. His voice was quiet, but razor sharp. That wasn't just anyone. That was a high-ranking Navy officer? You think this goes away? Keller looked away, grinding his teeth. She was disrespectful. She questioned you, Baker interrupted. That's not a crime, Keller scoffed, shaking his head. You don't get it, people like that. The chief's expression hardened. People like what? Silence. Keller swallowed but said nothing. Baker sighed, rubbing his forehead. The DA is reviewing every case you've handled for the past 5 years. You've been flagged for racial profiling, and let me be clear, this department isn't going down with you. Keller's stomach twisted. What does that mean? Baker straightened. It means you're on immediate suspension. Internal Affairs is investigating, and if they find what I suspect... He shook his head. Your career is over. The words hit like a gut punch. Keller's face burned. This is bull... Baker raised a hand. Don't finish that sentence. His tone was ice. Pack up your desk, and if I were you, I'd get a lawyer. Keller stood there, fists at his sides, his world unraveling in real time. For the first time, he realized, he wasn't untouchable. Across town, Amina sat in a quiet cafe, stirring her coffee as she scrolled through her phone. The case had already made headlines. The footage had gone viral. Lieutenant Commander wrongfully arrested. Officer under investigation. She wasn't surprised. From the moment she stepped out of her car that night, she knew exactly how this would play out. She had encountered men like Keller before, entitled, arrogant, accustomed to twisting the law to their advantage. But this time, he lost. Her phone buzzed. A message from her attorney. Keller has been suspended. Might face charges. Amina took a slow sip of her coffee. Good. She glanced out the window, watching the city carry on. The fight wasn't over. Not for her, and certainly not for those Keller had harmed before. But today? Today was a victory. The crisp afternoon air smelled of fresh rain as Amina stepped out of the cafe. The weight of the past 24 hours should have clung to her, but it didn't. She walked as she always did, head high, stride steady. Her phone buzzed again. This time the caller ID was familiar. She sighed, then answered. Captain. Lieutenant Commander? The voice on the other end was calm. I assume you've seen the news? I have. A brief silence. Then, and how are you feeling? Amina caught her reflection in a nearby storefront window. No exhaustion, no cracks in her composure. I feel like I did exactly what I was supposed to do, she said. The captain's voice softened. That's what I thought you'd say. A pause. The Department of Defense is taking an interest in your case. Don't be surprised if they ask you to speak on it. Amina exhaled through her nose. I'm not sure I want to be a headline. You already are, the captain countered. Whether you like it or not, what happened to you reflects something much bigger. She knew that, she had always known. Keller wasn't an anomaly. He was part of a system that had allowed officers like him to act without consequence for years. This wasn't just about her. It was about the countless others who had been in her position, but lacked the rank, the legal support, or the platform to fight back. Leaning against a streetlight, she watched the traffic move past. This isn't the first time something like this has happened, she said, and it won't be the last. No, the captain agreed, but it's the first time Keller is facing consequences, and that's because you didn't back down. Amina closed her eyes for a moment, letting the words settle. She hadn't backed down. Not when Keller pulled her over, not when he tried to intimidate her, not when the cuffs tightened around her wrists, not even when she spent the night behind bars, knowing the odds were against her. She had stood firm, and now she had won. The captain cleared his throat. One last thing, he added. You might be getting a call from the mayor's office. Amina raised an eyebrow. Oh? Seems they want to recognize you for handling the situation with professionalism and grace. She smirked. Now that's ironic. The captain chuckled. So, are you going to accept it? Amina thought for a moment, then shrugged. I'll think about it. She ended the call and slid her phone back into her pocket. Across the street, a mother walked hand in hand with her young son. He was laughing, carefree, full of life. Amina watched them for a moment. The next generation. She had fought for herself, yes, but she had also fought for him, for every black child who deserved to grow up in a world where men like Keller couldn't wield their badges like weapons. She took a deep breath and walked away. Her steps were firm, her purpose clear, because this fight was never just hers. It never had been. Unchecked power leads to abuse, and the only way to change the system is to hold it accountable. What happened to Amina happens to people every day. People without rank, without connections, without proof. That's why it's critical to speak up, to demand justice, to refuse silence. If this story made you think, share it. If it made you angry, talk about it. And if it made you realize how much work is left to do, stay engaged. Because real change begins with real conversations.